Streaming. Going live. Alrighty, we are live and in person. Welcome into Prudes Creek Missionary Baptist Church on a very cold morning. Our pipes froze at our house except for our toilet. Really weird thing there for our house to. We've had a year where the hot water line froze going into the shower. That was strange. But it'll thaw out today as temperatures go up. And it just, get cold weather and the wind going. Really just interesting how God does things and how the weather seems to do what it does. But I know a lot of folks are staying home because of how cold it is, and I hope and pray that you don't have frozen pipes. Hope that you're able to stay warm out there today and all these days. It's been really cold. My new job, I'm out in a shop with 3 walls, and there's no 4th wall, so that equipment can drive in and bring parts for us to fit up and weld together. But so that makes for interesting mornings for sure. Makes you really appreciate when you get to do a good bit of welding. But it is wintertime, so that is to be expected. And that's the type of job it is. So I hope everybody's able to find a place to stay warm and be blessed. We're going to continue on with the book of Isaiah, chapter 19. Still going through these oracles from God. And dealing with, this is God talking about how he's going to deal with his enemies. And, it's really interesting. As I've said before, Isaiah is a place to start if you want to understand prophecy. And there's things that are shadows of and reflections, maybe foreshadowing what is going to come in Revelation. There are chapters in here that do tie in with Revelation, maybe around chapters 40 and above, that come from Isaiah. But in this specifically, because this language in here talking about this is an oracle concerning Egypt, and there's things that are described in the way that we'll get into is looking at the first 15 verses. There's 25 verses in the chapter, but it's broken up into 2 parts because you have God's judgment, and then you have God's blessing. But we're in these first 15 verses, there's language that sounds very familiar if you've been through Revelation, looking at how God's going to deal with the judgments, the 21 judgments, the bowl judgments, the trumpet judgments, etc., that he does in Revelation, and the way it decimates the human population on earth. It especially goes after economies and those type of things. So we're going to see that here. So Revelation would actually be like an echo or continuation of these things. These oracles really actually have already happened. Now, it's going to sound like it because we're talking about Egypt here. They've already been dealt with once when God drove the Israelites out of Egypt. It's a place where they would have been too comfortable to leave otherwise. So God had to harden Pharaoh's heart to get them to actually leave. And in the process, there's kind of this recent word they've been associating with a lot of parts of the Bible, especially Genesis, a polemic. And I've talked about this before. We need to be careful that we don't just say the whole thing is one grand polemic. In other words, God's speaking against whatever the common thought process is at the time, whatever the common worship style or religion is. And when you look back at the plagues that were put on Egypt that helped the Israelites get out of Dodge, get to leave Egypt and finally head towards the land of Canaan, when God decided it was time for that, each one of those plagues was a polemic, was a judgment against the Egyptians and their gods. So you can go through all that and look at that's an interesting study. It's an interesting way to look at things. And we're going to see some of that here that's going to be reminiscent now that we're a few hundred years removed from Exodus. But we're also, we're not quite, we're about 600-700 years before Christ when Isaiah is given all these prophecies and all these oracles. So what we're going to talk about today is actually taken place a couple hundred years roughly after Isaiah gave these oracles from God. And so we're these are prophetic, but predominantly they have, especially when you take into account figurative language, but these have been basically fulfilled between 6th and 7th century BC. So, within 100 to 200 years after Isaiah gave these prophecies, they've by and large been fulfilled in regards to these nations. So looking at Isaiah chapter 19, verses 1 through 15, an oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. And the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. And I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight each against another, and each against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out. And I will confound their counsel, and they will inquire of the idols and the sorcerers, and the mediums and the necromancers. And I will give over the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master, and a fierce king will rule over them, declares the Lord God of hosts. And as the waters of the sea will be dried up, and the river will be dry and parched, and its canals will become foul, and the branches of Egypt's Nile will diminish and dry up. Reeds and rushes will rot away. There will be bare places by the Nile, on the brink of the Nile, and all that is sown by the Nile will be parched, will be driven away, and will be no more. The fishermen will mourn and lament, all who cast a hook in the Nile, and they will languish who spread nets on the water. The workers in combed flax will be in despair, and the weavers of white cotton. Those who are the pillars of the land will be crushed, and all who work for pay will be grieved. The princes of Zoan are utterly foolish. The wisest counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am a son of the wise, a son of ancient kings? Where then are your wise men? Let them tell you that they might know that the Lord of hosts has purposed against Egypt. The princes of Zoan have become fools, and the princes of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstones of her tribes have made Egypt stagger. The Lord has mingled within her a spirit of confusion, and they will make Egypt stagger in all its deeds. As a drunken man staggers in his vomit, and there will be nothing for Egypt that head or tail, palm branch or reed may do. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for your, again, dear Lord, we just continue to thank you for your patience, your long suffering, your many blessings that we don't deserve, dear Lord, and just the way you have dealt with mankind, dear Lord, that you have given us opportunities and chances after chances, dear Lord, and we just We're thank you for your word and that we're able to look back, dear Lord, that we would be able to study and learn lessons from the past and to see where your hand has worked, dear Lord, and where your will be done. We just ask that you would be with us in this church, dear Lord, be with those who would watch this video, that our hearts and our minds be open to you, that we would become better servants in your kingdom, dear Lord, that we would be able to wisely take these warnings and this history, dear Lord, and that we would be able to rightly apply it to current times, that we would be able to further your kingdom. Just be with those, dear Lord, who are fighting illness, dear Lord, just whether it be flu or cancer, touch their hearts, heal their bodies. Let your light shine, that they would come to know you or return to fellowship with you, dear Lord. And just be with us in this service. And we ask for all this in Jesus' precious name. So, again, the chapter split into two parts. You have judgment versus blessing. And we'll get into the blessing next time. We're going to look at the judgment part of this, verses 1 through 15 that I just read. And, Egypt has always been a safe harbor. That's where Joseph was able to feed his family and bring Abraham and his brothers over, Isaac and his brothers over, Jacob. All those, the tribes were able to survive there in Egypt for those 400 years. It wasn't the promised land. It wasn't a place for them to stay. This is why God did what he did in Exodus. And, but so you have that remnant, that 70 some odd bunch of descendants from Abraham, right? The tribes, the initial brothers that would become the 12 tribes of Egypt, in Egypt, 12 tribes of Israel. And so it's also a place where several hundred years later, even after the stuff that Isaiah talks about here, Egypt was a safe place for Christ to go to as an infant child, where Mary and Joseph took him to escape the persecution and the judgment from Herod at the time. But in between, they have their own problems, and it's really interesting because even after the Exodus, Egypt is still a powerful force, but they get conquered by the Assyrians. They get conquered by a number of different tribes or other nations. And even with their strength, they get conquered, but that makes those people even more powerful. But again, God's dealing with all these people. So he's got the oracles against Cush and against Assyria. And the Assyrians go in and deal with the Egyptians. And it was very difficult for them to recover from the Exodus. But they've never directly come against Israel. Even to this day, thousands of years later, since the reestablishment of Israel, I believe they were the first Muslim nation to actually make a treaty back in 1948. At that time, and they have not openly come against Israel. They're not any help with Palestine, the so-called Palestinians and all that. They're not any help with them. They're probably doing something behind closed doors that nobody else knows about. But, as far as being an enemy to Israel, they're not real happy with what happened in the Exodus, but they're still a strong nation nonetheless, and they're not necessarily a friend to Israel, even though they're not an enemy, so to speak. They're not a friend either. But it's enough that God is going to pass judgment on them. But again, there's a blessing that we'll get into next time. But we're going to look at this. And so God comes in verses 1 through 4. And what's interesting, the term polemic I mentioned earlier, is a number of these things God does in direct opposition to man-made gods and man-made religion. And one of the things that the Egyptians would do is they would show their gods coming in on clouds. One of their chief gods in Egypt was Baal, and Baal was often depicted coming in on a cloud. And so here's God himself riding in on a swift cloud, and he's actually doing stuff. That's one of the things when you go back and look at Exodus is all the gods of Egypt. That's crocodiles, frogs, flies, the different animals that they would use to represent different things, cows. And it represented all these different things, and each one of the plagues coincided with one of their gods, and it's God himself saying, I'm better than your false idol, and I'm active, and I'm true, and I'm real. And so here's God. Now, this is figurative language, but again, it's language that the Egyptians would understand. It's language that any of the Israelites who are in that area or associated with them or knew them, they would understand when here's, God's going to ride in on a swift cloud, the one true God. That's going to make them concerned. And so when the Egyptians actually deal with this situation, that's the imagery they're going to have, and that's going to cause them to stop and pause and actually recognize this when they hear this. And so it would cause their hearts to melt. In other words, get scared. Do you get depressed? You get concerned. What have we done to upset the gods, right? And so there will be civil strife that will come about. God coming down in there, and this swift cloud, he comes in there, he causes civil strife, and they're going to, and just like everybody else that we're getting all these oracles about, when your nation gets into trouble, what do? You run to your leadership at all levels. And Egypt being as big as it was, even as big as it is today, and very similar to us, we have president, and we have senators and congressmen, then we have governors, and then the governors have state senators and state congressmen, and all the way down. So you get down onto the local level, even down to the elected dog catcher, right? But we're going to look to our leadership when there's a time of crisis. And so here's God coming in to pass judgment and deal with you, and you're turning to your leaders who are doing dumb stuff. And a lot of times when you have a large empire, so to speak, or a large nation like in Egypt or even Babylon, whatever, they would have governors or the children of Pharaoh or whoever's in charge get to a certain age and they become governors or princes of different regions, and it's broken up if they want to assign, give something for their children to do to actually learn leadership, to be able to see who would be able to take over the throne when they die. So you have these princes of these different regions of Egypt. Of course, Memphis, we know about Memphis, Tennessee. Well, Memphis was actually originally a city in Egypt, a region. So is Zoan. That's mentioned in here. And so you have these princes of these people in charge of these different regions. They all answer to the Pharaoh. And God's going to confound their counsel. In other words, they're not going to be able to make wise decisions. They're scared. They don't know what's going on. It's going to be rash. It's going to be dumb. They're going to be just doing things that are not smart. And it's because they're running around in fear. And the people, when they see that there's no support, or there's no wisdom or anything good coming out of the princes and the pharaohs and the different people like that, they're going to go to the they're going to worship the idols. They're going to go to the sorcerers, the necromancers. They're going to go to all the religious people. And Egyptians actually were big time into necromancy. It's trying to communicate with the dead. It's a big part of their religion there in Egypt. They had a god of the underworld, and supposedly they're able to communicate with the dead and weirdness like that. And that's specifically something God tells the Israelites, don't do that. It's not for you guys to communicate with the dead. But so in the middle of all of that, right, so you have the civil strife going on. The leadership is failing. There's no relief. Again, that's a common theme through all these oracles. There's no relief from your leadership and your religious leaders. No relief from your false gods, right? So all that's going on, where you see in verses 5 through 10, and the Nile region, the Nile River running through Egypt, but the land surrounding the Nile on both sides was very fertile. So there was a lot of crops. There was a lot of food grown there on the edges of the Nile. The reeds were harvested and used for a lot of different things within commerce. I mean, baskets among other things, but you make a lot of different products from reeds. And so you have this massive economic region right there going down the river, plus you're able to actually transport your goods from from the north, one end of the river to the other. And so you had transport, you had produce and food. You also were able to keep animals nearby because they could drink from the Nile River. They had access to the water. They would dig canals that would give them little offshoots all along the way. And so all of these things that they begin to rely upon suddenly are no longer there. They're able to grow things like flax and linen, cloth to make clothes out of. And so Egyptian linen was a very sought after, very popular textile. And so they were able to make a lot of money. And you had this whole lot of commerce and a whole lot of trading going on. Well, as the Nile River shrinks up and dries up, now did it fully dry up? No. But it was enough that, as it mentions in here, the canals would become foul. So you ended up with spots where the water is still some water in there, but the Nile River is receded enough that you end up with a stagnant body of water. Well, if it's stagnant, nothing grows in stagnation. It'll kill your animals. It's full of bacteria. It's full of all these nastiness. You can't drink it. It's just not good. And so as God swoops on swiftly on his cloud and confounds the leadership, you see where God also affects the river Nile, which affects the economy. So you're talking about unwise leadership doing dumb things. You're talking about the economy crashing, and there's no relief from your false religions and your false idols. So all of those things that the polemic, all those plagues that were put against the false Egyptian gods back at the Exodus, they really kind of didn't learn their lesson. They went right back to worshiping these false gods again. Once everything settled down and the Israelites were gone. And so the Egyptian Empire, through all of their, it doesn't quite get into it, but their pride and their arrogance, their belief in their false idols, their belief in their own ability to make their own way, so to speak. And that's not dissimilar from us here in America. We're a prosperous nation. We have all the resources we could possibly want or need. We don't need to buy oil from another country. We don't need to buy coal. We don't need to buy any of the precious metals. I say that our technology, especially with computerized stuff these days, and the so-called push towards everything being battery stuff, we need rare earth minerals that we really don't have in the United States, but we have everything else. And we really can be a self-sufficient nation without anybody else's help. And so Egypt was very much like that. They can be self-sufficient. Certainly at this time, they had enough stuff, and people were coming and buying from them. But again, their trade, being able to go up and down the Nile River, suddenly stops. And it kills their economy. And all of this because they don't worship the one true God. And again, while they're not a direct enemy to Israel, they're not a friend to them either. And God's going to be dealing with Egypt and with Assyria. And so that whole region in the Middle East, that whole area that surrounds the temple there in Jerusalem, and it's going to be interesting to see how God deals with these nations and then eventually blesses them. It's God's judgment on Israel at this time. So again, this is around 600 to 700 BC when these things actually do take place. And they get conquered by the Nubians at that point, which the Nubians were just south. That's Cush. They're just south of Cush. It's that area between Egypt and Ethiopia. I know this, I said this last week, that King James says Ethiopia. Cush is just above Ethiopia, actually. And so we see a lot of this actually does get fulfilled when, again, the Nubians and this is kind of why King James gets into that, but the Nubians / Ethiopians rule. So that group of people down there in Cush comes up. They conquer Egypt. They do that for several years, and they're a constant plague and a constant problem. But the underlying thing of all this is they're not worshiping the one true God, despite all the stuff they experienced and saw firsthand at the Exodus. And then granted, we are a few hundred years later, but despite all of that, they still go back to worshiping the false gods and the false idols, and nothing that any of that helps. There's none of that helps them at all in dealing with these supposed natural disasters. Now, God is making these things happen. He's dealing with everybody in the Middle East. God is dealing with everybody that surrounds Israel. We know from looking at these things that these are, if they're not a direct enemy, they're not a friend to Israel either, which means they're not a friend to God. But we'll see the blessing when we get into the last 10 verses, next time we meet, where there's going to be a turn, and they're going to recognize God, and they're going to worship the one true God. Everybody's going to do that. God's going to deal with these people, and the Syrians are a big problem. As I said, the Egyptians are conquered from the south by the land of Cush and the Nubians and the Ethiopians. And they deal with some very harsh things during 600 to 700 BC, where they're conquered by this guy Ashurbanipal, who is the son of one of the Nubian kings that first conquered Egypt. This guy comes along, reconquers Egypt. There's just a whole lot of strife. These things did happen, and during this time, the Nile River did shrink. As best as they've been able to find within history, it's it's an interesting time, and it's again seeing how God is dealing with people who worship false idols. And so here we are today, still worshiping false idols. You go to Egypt, they did have a Christian presence. They still do to a small extent. The Coptic Christians are there, but they're basically a Muslim nation now, so they're still worshiping false idols, false gods. And it's just not a good thing for them. And despite learning these lessons, despite these situations that God puts them in, and even with their momentary worship of the one true God, they still go back to their roots, and their roots are down there in false religion, false gods, and false idols. And all this does is speak to where your nation will be if you're chasing after false idols. And here we are in America as a whole, and the nation of Israel right now, I'm not going to say is worshiping false idols, but they're not necessarily looking to God for help with everything, because they still are going to, they're coming to the U.S., they're going to Russia, they're going to these foreign nations, they're going to the European Union, despite all the anti-Semitism that they receive from all these people. And yeah, even from our side of things to an extent here in America, they still deal with anti-Semitism from our leadership here during whichever political administration it is. But they shouldn't be going to us for help or the Russians for help. They should be going to God directly for help. And that's where we all are, is who are we seeking when there is a famine, when there is a natural disaster, when all these problems are happening? Are we going to God first, or are we going to man first? Are we going to the government? We have a number of so-called religions here in America that are not true Christian religions. They call themselves Christians, but they're not, and they're foolish. They're preaching a false gospel, and we've seen with some of these false religions, some of these false gospel preachers in the health and wellness crowd, the prosperity preachers and stuff, we've seen firsthand, when a natural disaster hits, they're not there helping anybody. And so we see constantly around us, you can't rely on anybody but God. But we still cry out for the government. We still cry out for whatever local leadership to come and fix this problem. And there's appropriate times to do that. I'm not saying we should never do that. But when we have our problems, the very first place we should go to is the one true God himself. Then we should go and see what the world deals with, or what the world suggests. And when we do that, that's the proper order to things. We seek God. We seek his face, his forgiveness, his will, and then we go and we see what man has to say. The Egyptians didn't do that. Now, they're going to be judged. They're going to be brought down to this point of where they finally are going to call out to the one true God. And again, we're going to see that next week when we get into the blessing. And it'll be good to see how God treats the people who actually turn towards him. And so you and I today, we can turn towards God, or we can turn towards man. The better thing, the best thing, is to turn towards God. If we can remember to do that first, then we're going to be much better off. But history of mankind is we can do it on our own. We can do it without God's help, and the sad truth is that we can't. We study our Bible, it should show us and remind us that we can't do it all on our own. And I'm not saying God never uses government for good things, but again, we go to God first and we seek his wisdom, we seek his patience, we seek his forgiveness. And once we have gotten through that and heard from God on that end of things, if we're all in tune and we're all doing that, then when it comes together for us helping each other, or when it comes time for government to actually step in and help with the situation, if we've all gone to God, and that includes the government, goes to God first, then what we do in response to the situations where we need God's help, there will be much more wisdom, there will be much better turnout, and it will last much, much longer than just mankind doing it on their own. So that's what we've got for this week. Like I said, we'll meet together next week, and we'll get into the blessing. We'll see what happens when the Egyptians and the Assyrians actually turn to God, including Israel. And that'll be the second half of this chapter. So again, I hope and pray that you're able to stay warm. Continue to pray for my mother. She got some good results with her cancer that has shrunk. That's good news to hear. And they got some folks out there with some surgeries coming up, so we pray that the correct thing will be done, that needs to be done, that God will guide the hands of the surgeons and those people who are dealing with that. Continue to pray for those who have lost loved ones recently. And continue to pray for this church. And just pray that God will lead us in the direction he would have us to go, and that he will send servants that will be able to actually get out in this community. So, with that being said, I will see you guys next week.